For the mass of the people, the land was the overlord, dictating where and how the course of your life would unfold. The number and richness of its acres would certainly dictate your wealth, probably your health. The boundaries of love and ambition, your place in the social pecking order, the roof over your head, the food on your plate. Those who stayed in rural Ireland to accept the land's writ could act out their unchanging lives in the footsteps of their fathers or grandfathers. A peasant people, they took flattered satisfaction in being portrayed by poet or propagandist as the essential, the true Irish, the people of the thatched cottage, the tiny homestead with the cow and the sow. Just 2 generations before, with the land war, they had inherited the earth, such as it was. Now they awaited the fruits of independence, the promise that money and better times would flow once the ancient enemy was exorcised. But now they were to find themselves, the ragged ranks, the foot soldiery, in an economic war with that old foe. And these were the people who would suffer the hardship, the wounds, and the losses of that war more than any other. It was, of course, a war about money. We refused to pay back the millions of pounds the British had spent in buying up land to divide between a land-hungry peasantry and thus end the so-called land war in Ireland in the last century. Those who now worked and owned that land in Ireland still had to pay the so-called land annuities to their government, but the money was not handed on to London, so they refused to take our exports. And the land was our business as a nation. We lived by exporting its beef and its butter. But those were now the ammunition and the artillery of this new kind of war, and the casualties were to be found strewn on the land of our rural smallholders. They were the people who stood penniless outside the bank at street fairs in the vain hope of finding a buyer for stock which had been coaxed up out of poor land. In other times, the buyers from the Midlands would have been here, buying the young stock to fatten it up on the richer land of Westmeath and elsewhere, its profitable export fattening many a bank account there. The economic war ended all that. Now the smallholder would wait in hopeless hope of a buyer, and finding none, in failure he would at dusk herd homeward the stock he had driven out at dawn. And he might well have pondered that the annuities battle wasn't his fight at all. His annuities had always been low. It was the big landowner who gained from reductions. And the market was now so bad you had to decide if it was worth bringing unsold stock home again. With no money coming in, how were you to feed them? Farmers who couldn't pay their local rates now hoped the collector would instead seize his cattle. They were only worth half what he could have gotten for them 5 years beforehand. Farmers in Waterford said they'd never suffered such depression, and their debts at the creamery were mounting. And on the farm, De Valera's new self-sufficiency dream, an economy by and for ourselves alone, was adding to the problem. Following the European mood of the time, he had opted to cut us off from the international economic system, which he believed had failed us. We would instead build our own mills and factories, grow our own food, make our own clothes. We would give grants to farmers to grow grain for those mills, to grow sugar beet for new factories. But it was the bigger farmers with the better land who got those grants. The small farmers found their bread was dearer because the baker was forced to use Irish wheat instead of the cheaper imported Canadian grain. Sugar was dearer because it came from Irish beet, not imported cane. Their plight brought a plaintive appeal from the Fianna Fáil Common in Inchigeelagh, which told how local people on the small farms couldn't now afford even to keep a pig or a few chickens. They couldn't afford the new high price of the feed. And some of those supposedly cosy homesteads saw scenes reminiscent of, though not as harsh as, the Great Hunger, except that the infamous yellow meal rejected in the famine was now eaten by many families who bought it while pretending to shopkeeper and neighbours it was to feed the animals. While they grew their crops and stock on the farm, they made their money at the fair. But those streets of the 30s were now in stupor, and rural life continued in a vein little changed in half a century. Life on those farms followed patterns worn into everyday work, play, getting and spending by the generations which had previously passed through the landscape. The land was man's business, getting it, working it, keeping it. There was nothing more important to the family well-being. Out in the field, he was the boss, deciding what field would be ploughed for what crop, and it was he or his grown son who would follow the plough and take on other jobs which called for muscle or machine, proud before the neighbours of how much land he could turn under the plough in a day, of the good yield of the potatoes or the other crops, of his expertise with machinery. These were masculine matters and the measure of a farmer, a measure of a man, when they gathered of an evening to smoke a pipe and to chat. Winter days, with no crops to tend, would go in digging out drains to keep fields dry and in good order. It was a matter of pride that he might take a poor field and lift its fertility, its profitability, by spreading seaweed over many years. There was the machinery to tend to as well, the mowing bar possibly, or maybe just the spades and sprongs. The family home and outbuildings had to be kept in good repair as they climbed the thatch to compete with the sparrows, picking at the damp mass, burrowing for the tiny pink worms which lurked there. Such things cost money, and it was a bad farmer who'd see money go to waste. And the men of an area rivaled each other in their tasks, the best man to cut and save a field of hay, to lop a tree, to shear a sheep. Skills eagerly learned by the next generation as they were handed down through a narrow school which resisted the influence of the newly trained agricultural instructors. The women took on some work out in the fields, but it was secondary to the man's role. It was his business to drive the horse-drawn hay bar, though acceptable and necessary in the race against the rain, for the women to help pitch and rake it. But it was again man's work to build the rick and the haggard. In the potato field, the man would unearth the praties with spade or plough. The women might pick them. The ladies did the lighter tasks. But that standing as head of the family carried a heavy responsibility. It was the man's business to turn the family's hard work, the farm's produce, to best advantage in cash. It was he, maybe with the elder son, who trudged off to the market in the nearest town to pitch his wits against the cattle jobber, to bargain and to tangle, as the phrase had it, the son watching and learning, but not interfering in the man's preserve. The family looked to him to get the best deal because it affected them all. Hard bargaining won respect, but if he failed in his responsibilities in those tough 30s, he could be despondently sloping home, herding his cattle ahead of him, and he feeling the lash of a wife's stinging tongue. A man would still have his place by the hob in the evening, but there would be the knowing looks of the family and the remarks of the neighbours to contend with, as failure at the fair dragged down a man's stock in life for the second time in a day. And in those hard times, the chance of a job off the farm to increase the family income was a rare prize, money from heaven. Factories were few and far between, except in the towns. But even out here in the country, he might be lucky, and when the land at home wasn't too busy, he might pick up temporary work at one of Horace Plunkett's creameries, which were now dotted around the countryside. More likely, though still rare enough, a man might come by a job on the local roads with the county council, though increasingly the government was now letting money out to fund employment schemes like this, and a sure pay packet was money in the bank. But still, a man who had land was conscious of his standing in the community, superior to a landless labourer, for instance. Not for a farmer the despised and back-breaking job of breaking stones with a sledgehammer, the common means of the time of producing infill for the roads, though he might well spread them into the potholes or help out with a new steamroller. Such machines were now making their way into the rural scene and were a matter of pride. Lucky the man who could afford one of the new tractors. Less fortunate the farm labourer it might dispossess of a job. One more for the road. A man whose land bordered the sea was doubly fortunate, not just for the seaweed which was piled into the fields as fertilizer, but part-time fishing could bring in money as well as varying and filling out the family diet, at a time when meat was a once-a-week event in poorer homes. Fishing was a craft which had been promoted by the congested district boards to give local men a livelihood. Those were boards set up in the years before independence to take on areas literally congested with too many people for the poor local economy to sustain. They gave jobs in public works and by trying to get local produce to profitable markets elsewhere. Hard work and investment now meant that tiny harbour walls dotted the coast, and the boards organised the transport of the catch to towns. Some of it even got to Dublin and London. But the sea didn't capture the mind of the Free State government, and the industry declined somewhat.